All right, everyone, we're going to begin our final session. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, I'm Danya Amori, the director of the Wallace Stegner Center's Environmental Dispute Resolution Program. And it's my pleasure to moderate this session on confronting the recreation-conservation divide. For those of you who've been in the room over the last 2 days, you probably recognize this is really a key theme that keeps coming up. And so I think we really wanted some time to address it directly. We are joined today by two speakers who published what might be considered very contradictory and also complementary articles in High Country News last year on this particular topic. Next to me is Ethan Linck, who's a PhD candidate in the University of Washington Department of Biology. And Ethan published the article, "Your Stoke Won't Save Us," in the High Country News, again, last May. And basically, the article makes the case that outdoor recreation enthusiasm alone won't support conservation on public lands. Louis Geltman, who's also joining us, who is the policy director for the Outdoor Alliance, published a response, again in the High Country News, which was titled, quote, "Actually, I think Stoke will save us." And as the title suggests, it basically argues that outdoor recreation enthusiasm can and will be a powerful force for conservation. So we have invited them here today to continue this conversation in person. I had the opportunity to talk to them briefly about a week ago just to make sure we were all ready for this session, and it was a surprise to me to learn they hadn't actually talked to each other since publication of those articles. So we've had a little bit of time to talk together. We have a lot more to say. Interestingly enough, I think there was a bit of a Twitter exchange following the publication of those articles. As you all know, Twitter is a great place to resolve complex problems, so I'm sure we don't have a lot to say today. So I really want you all to know what to expect from this session. This is not a debate. I'm a facilitator. I'm a collaborative process designer, so I designed a little collaborative process here. And our goal is really to talk through the complexity of this issue and the different nuances of that tension between recreation and conservation. So I've asked these two to share their thoughts, to be provocative where they need to, and even ask questions of each other, but to really try to keep it productive and to not just rehash the issues. We've had a lot of time to talk about that over the last 2 days, but to really work towards some co-creation of solutions, pathways forward. So hopefully we'll have a lot of time to talk about that. I do want to remind you all that we are taking questions via Slido, and we will hopefully have some time to talk about the things you suggest here, so please continue to suggest your questions using Slido. And I think with that, I'm going to get us started. So since some of you may have read those articles, but probably a lot of you haven't, I asked both Ethan and Louis to prepare just brief 4 to 5 minute statements giving you a background of the articles, why they wrote them, and to say a little bit more about themselves. So if you don't mind, Ethan, I'm going to pass it over to you to just say again a bit more about yourself and to give us an overview of the article.
Yeah, thanks so much, Danya, for having me, and thanks to Bob for the invitation, and for everyone here. So my background in my day job, I'm a biologist. I'm not a practicing conservationist, but a lot of the work I do as a population geneticist is conservation adjacent. I think a lot about biodiversity, population sizes, and risks to species. But I'm also a really, what you might say, extremely avid recreationist. The last time I was in Salt Lake City was to run the Wasatch 100. Didn't go so well. But I basically, these two aspects of my life have been really important to me for a long time. And they always seemed really complementary, that the reason I was interested in nature was because I'm an outdoor recreationist and vice versa to some extent. But after a while, I sort of grew a little suspicious that these were necessarily easy bedfellows. And I think we all know people who are probably, like most people in this room, really invested in getting outside, but also really committed to the landscapes they play in. But whether that actually held globally seemed less clear to me, and there's certainly a bit of ascertainment bias in just like who you're likely to run into at a Stegner Center meeting. And so I sort of started looking into what the empirical basis for this assumption that is pretty frequently tossed around, that you just need to get people outside and then they'll learn to care about the environment and become like an active voter on environmental issues, or maybe volunteer their time, have sort of environmentally positive attitudes, whether there was any evidence for this. And so it turns out there's about 45 years of research in the sociology and human geography literature looking at basically this exact thesis in a number of different contexts. And what's really striking about it is the total lack of evidence for this assumption. In some cases, you do get the sort of correlations you'd expect. Like we just had a great presentation on support from hunters and anglers for wildlife conservation. And you do see correlations on that sort of small scale. But what was striking to me is how often that doesn't hold up across lines of who we are as recreationists. Backpackers in this initial study that kind of kicked off the avalanche of other studies seemed to care pretty little about wildlife conservation, although they were interested in funding for national parks. And so this was really interesting to me. I also sort of wanted to dig in a bit to how outdoor recreation as an economic driver and as a cultural value has shaped the landscapes we actually choose to protect. And we've already heard today about how private land tends to be the really productive, biologically rich land next to river courses, and we have a disproportionate representation of scenic rock and ice in our system, which we all love, but is maybe not necessarily an objective decision based on ecological values or biodiversity values or these other values we might also want to consider. And then finally, since we're in sort of this period of a renewed fight for the future of public lands against a myriad of different threats, and the outdoor industry has really stepped up to the plate and become a really prominent actor in this, I wanted to look at potential conflicts based on their sort of new role, and whether the fact that there might be a profit motive should give us a little pause. And one thing that really stuck out to me, which has been brought up several times at this conference so far, is the really stated opposition to an excise tax by the Outdoor Industry Alliance on anything like what hunters and anglers have traditionally paid, and what that might tell you about their willingness to sacrifice profit or the bottom line to continue in this fight that seems to be sort of shared values. So I really came away with the idea, and this was the thesis I tried to advance in my article, that it's not so simple as just getting people outside and putting them on a mountain bike, that there might be a series of interventions that we can do to try to make people who are interested in outdoor recreation into committed environmentalists, but it really might start there. It doesn't end there, and there's a lot of work to do.
Thanks, Ethan. Thanks for having me here. I agree with everything you just said, which is probably an awkward start to the conversation. But my name is Louis Geltman. I'm the policy director for Outdoor Alliance. We're a coalition of the national advocacy organizations for climbers, kayakers, mountain bikers, backcountry skiers. Our member organizations are American Whitewater, American Canoe Association, International Mountain Bicycling Association, Access Fund, Winter Wildlands Alliance, Colorado Mountain Club, American Alpine Club, or Colorado Mountain Club, the Mazamas, the Mountaineers, and Surf Rider Foundation. And our mission is to protect the human-powered outdoor recreation experience on public lands and waters. Broadly, our work kind of falls into three categories. The first one is places. So that's taking places on public lands that are managed for multiple use and elevating them into some sort of protective designation, whether that's wilderness or wild and scenic rivers or a national monument or whatever it might be. The second thing is policies, working to secure policy that secures recreation and conservation values on public lands. So that could be working to reauthorize the Land and Water Conservation Fund, or to fix fire suppression budgeting in the Forest Service, or defend against these ideas about transferring the public lands to the states, attacks on NEPA or the Antiquities Act. And then the third thing for us is really people. We really think of ourselves as a civic engagement organization, and we're really committed to educating our community about public lands management, helping people become more engaged as advocates, whether that's from really basic actions like emailing their members of Congress or calling, to showing up at town hall meetings, to maybe working as part of a local grassroots organization, all the way to things like participating in forest planning. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and from a really young age, whitewater kayaking was something that I was really passionate about. The opportunity to experience wild places is something that really shaped my life, and eventually I decided that I wanted to have a career in conservation advocacy, and that brought me to law school in the Pacific Northwest, and I've been there for about 12 years now. So what motivated me to write my response was a couple of things that I sort of took issue with in Ethan's piece. I think the first is really the idea that there's not necessarily a relationship between conservation and outdoor recreation. That doesn't comport with my own personal experience, sort of the way I've gone through life. It sounds like the way Ethan's gone through his, and certainly all of my colleagues at our member organizations, they're all folks who are really passionate outdoors people and also really passionate about conservation. The second thing I think was we really take a lot of pride in our work, and I felt like there needed to be some words in defense of the work that our partner organizations are doing, that our partners in the outdoor industry are doing, and hunting and angling groups are doing, because I really believe that those organizations and those individuals are effective advocates for conservation. And then the last thing, and I think this is really the most important piece of it for me, is we, as I said earlier, we really do think of ourselves as a civic engagement organization and trying to bring people from the outdoor recreation space into conservation advocacy. And I really hated the idea that somebody might read something that made them feel like they weren't good enough to be advocates for conservation because they're motivated by some self-interest, or because they're only interested in one particular place, or maybe they're not experienced or don't understand conservation biology at a really high level. And it's really my belief personally, and I think the value of our organization, our belief that securing lasting wins in conservation is going to take a real broad-based political movement. And I wanted, the people who we're trying to bring into this conversation to feel empowered to be participants in advocacy and conservation.
Great, thank you both. Before we start to talk about maybe some of the areas where you agree and maybe some areas where you specifically disagree, I want to hear just a little bit more about each of your articles. So Ethan, a key line in your article reads, quote, "Can outdoor recreation really support conservation for the long-term health of the land, not just human access? In the face of the daunting planetary environmental challenges ahead, can Stoke really save us? I suspect the answer is a hollow no," unquote. So tell us more about this thesis, and since we're not all millennials here, tell us what you meant by Stoke and why you're not convinced it's enough.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I should be honest that I chose the word stoke because I knew it would be rhetorically very effective. I knew it would be a broadside. Actually came up with the title for the article with my editor before we actually wrote it. But there's a broader point, there are a couple broader points to that. So for people who aren't saturated in contemporary outdoor recreation media, stoke is a sort of dominant theme of how people recreate and get outside, at least at the level that's represented by national publications and on Instagram. And it's sort of both a feeling and a lifestyle, is how I like to think about it. And the feeling is something that, like, you go out for a good mountain bike ride and you're totally stoked because there's adrenaline, there's flow, there's like a rush. You're just like really in the moment and enjoying that and like positive about the experience. I think that's sort of the definition of stoke everyone can agree on. But I would also say that I think stoke is sort of, it's kind of a lifestyle too, or an ethos. And like, a lot of people I know are just very stoked people. They're just very positive and enthusiastic about life and getting outside. And I think and this is maybe something we can return to, but I think there's a sense in the outdoor recreation community that like we're sort of all in it together and we have the same values, and it's just about like having a good time and like taking care of each other and the planet, and maybe not always a ton of interrogation of where we have non-overlapping values or different values. So I wanted to tap into that sense. But I also wanted to use stoke because, as Danya said, it's very much a millennial word, and I am someone who gets stoked. I think we're all probably familiar with an older iteration of this debate, because it's certainly not the first time it's been around, which may have manifest as a divide between backpackers and mountain bikers, or backpackers and trail runners. And I really wasn't, I thought I wanted to throw my hat in the ring with this argument because I am someone who enjoys more adrenaline-focused recreation. I'm not necessarily a purist who thinks the only way you can experience nature, experience wilderness is on sedate backpacking trips, being really reverent and reading Desert Solitaire. I don't think that. So I really wanted to at least, and maybe the more cynical way to put this is like have a bit of a claim, make myself a believable narrator. Like I am part of this world and I'm skeptical about it, but it's not because I don't get it and love it. But I guess I took that definition and I tweaked it for the purposes of my argument. And I really focused in on the idea that stoke is something inward looking. It's an experience that you can share through Instagram, but it's really something you're feeling. And I wanted to set that in contrast to the idea of awe, and this is something I didn't throw into my essay, but I should have. But we've heard a bit about the idea of awe earlier at this conference and how awe kind of makes us a better person. And for me, in the purposes of the essay, stoke is something that it might not be incompatible with a sense of reverence for a greater landscape, but I do think it represents something different, and it's a different goal for getting outside. And I would argue, and tried to argue, that it is one that has fairly little correlation with caring about places outside of your immediate experience, caring about things that don't affect your recreation access or recreation experience. And I think that the real challenge of the 21st century is getting people to care about things that don't affect their immediate experience as recreationists, as citizens, as we face down the barrel of the gun of climate change and the extinction crisis. It's going to take a lot, and I think it's going to take getting people to be curious and engaged about things that aren't relevant to them.
So there's a lot of themes in what you just said that I hope we have time to pick up on. But Lewis, I want to return to you and say your response to Ethan's argument, as stated in your article, is, quote, meaningful conservation is driven by action, not sentiment, not vaguely defined environmental concern, as measured by some researcher more than 40 years ago, not even education. It's organizing to deliver political pressure and make change, and by that measure, outdoor recreationists and the outdoor industry are delivering. And stoke, genuine enthusiasm derived from visceral experience, is the fuel that's driving action, unquote. You conclude, quote, I think Stoke is going to save us, unquote. So tell us more about what you meant and how you see that Stoke, or what do you mean by Stoke and how do you see it being a key force?
I think a real distinction from the way that we're thinking about Stoke and its role in advocacy has to do with, I feel like Ethan you're interested in sort of the gradations of conservation ethic or the values that we ascribe to these places, and I don't really take issue with that, your calculus there. I think the difference for me is what I'm thinking about much more is not how good is somebody's conservation ethic, but what are they doing? And it's like, how do we move people along the spectrum from inaction to action, from somebody who has these values but isn't necessarily acting on those values to somebody who's showing up and being a participant in advocacy and a participant in land management decision making or whatever it might be. And to me, Stoke is it's a fired up feeling, right? It's like you're feeling engaged and awake and energetic, right? And it's like, that's what I'm interested in sort of harnessing, is that enthusiasm to move people from inaction to action. And I think that's maybe a little bit of a difference in focus between our two pieces. I think very often about, this is something that I'm sure I can only paraphrase, but it's something that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said in regard to her election campaign, and she said that her swing voter was from non-voter to voter. And I think that's sort of analogous to what we're trying to do here, right? We're trying to take people who already agree with us in some sense and move them from inaction to action. And I think Stoke, just that fired up feeling, that participation in a culture that hopefully includes advocacy and a conservation ethic as a part of its identity, taking that energy and moving that towards some productive end is something I think about a lot.
So as somebody who does collaboration work, conflict resolution work, I find that often we think we disagree about more than we actually do, and we often have a lot more in common than we think. And as I read your pieces, I suspected that might be the case for both of you. And Lewis, I think you've already illuminated that you think a lot of what Ethan said is very valuable. I think that goes both ways. So I want to flesh that out a bit more and hear from both of you, based on what you've read from each other and heard in any conversations you've had. What do you see as areas where you really see eye to eye or have a lot of agreement? And maybe what are some of the differences in how you're thinking based on what you now know?
Yeah, I have, I think the first read of both our pieces, it seems like we're at each other's throats. And then the second read, it's sort of like, wait, do we actually disagree? And I think actually the part that's apparent to me when you read our articles where we really kind of come together on a common theme is in essentially the concluding paragraphs, which is nicely structural. And one thing that I tried to conclude with in my article was, okay, so if it's not a straight line from A to B, what can help get us there? And there's this other concept in the human geography and sociological literature on place identity, which is, I think, something we're all probably think about and have heard of. And place identity is the rare thing that seems to cut across socioeconomic variables like race and class and gender to predict how much someone is likely to have quote unquote environmentally positive attitudes or think positively about conservation efforts, but also how much they're likely to act out those values, their sort of environmentally friendly behavior. And so the question sort of becomes, well, how can you build place identity? Like, how do we really have communities that are bonded to the landscapes they inhabit? And I think, and hopefully we can get into this a bit later, I think there are a lot of lessons from the environmental justice community that we can draw in here. I mean, I think we both have very white perspectives on outdoor recreation that are sort of majoritarian in terms of how they're represented in the media, but not all communities, and certainly not traditionally disadvantaged communities, recreate in the same way, and yet you have tremendous success in getting sort of exactly what you're saying and getting people to swing from non-voter to voter, to like rally around restoration efforts in the Duwamish and, you know, my home is Seattle, or you know, there are plenty of examples. But I also think this is one area where recreation is really compatible, and I don't, you know, a response that was pretty frequent to my article was the sort of, and we heard a bit about this from Carl earlier today, was, well, what is the good kind of recreation? Like, what recreation will make you care about the landscape? And I think that could be being on an OHV, I think that could be trail running, I think it could be a sedate backpacking trip with Desert Solitaire, but I do think the thing that sticks out to me is it's a level of commitment that comes to build that place identity, a level of daily practice. And there's a really, it's a master's thesis, it's not published, but I think it's a really hopeful message about rock climbers in New York who are there maybe half the year out at the crag, who have place identity just through the roof. And it's as measured by this study. And that is, I think, you know, on the one hand you might say, well, that actually, you know, totally wipes out your entire thesis, but I think of it as really as where the nuance comes from. And that's what I tried to end my article on. And I reading the last paragraph of your article, I felt like we were circling around a similar theme there. I don't know if you have more thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. I think again, it's like the contrast is just the difference in focus. I think I'm sort of, it feels, I mean, maybe this is coming from the perspective of the work that I do, where it feels to me like whether or not people have a conservation ethic feels like a less pressing concern to me in terms of how we get results, rather than taking the people who do have that conservation ethic and like helping them become advocates. And I think crossing that divide from, you know, somebody who has, you know, even if you have sort of like a weak conservation ethic, there's probably something you care about and something useful you could do that's positive, all the way to somebody who really is, I don't know, is very environmentally correct or whatever it might be, but it's about helping people make that transition into advocacy. And so I think that, you know, that place attachment, it's certainly like super important, and outdoor recreation seems to be the way that comes to pass for most people, right? I mean, I think that, you know, every time we have, and again, as you said earlier, this is sort of a self-selecting group, but whenever you have these sort of gatherings and people ask for hands about how many people got into advocacy through their own personal experiences outdoors, it's 100% pretty much. And so I think what we need to do is just take that enthusiasm, kind of meet people where they're at, and then help them navigate this really complex world of advocacy, because taking action and putting those values that I think are broadly shared and really exist in a majority of people at some level, at least, helping to make those primary values rather than secondary values, or take those from things that you know sort of agree with, but it's your third voting issue, and make that something that you're showing up fired up about at town hall meetings.
I guess I have a follow-up question. One thing that I've been thinking about a lot over the course of the meeting is the difference between sort of being on the reactive, which I think it often feels as someone who's supportive of public lands and conservation broadly, where you're sort of responding to threats, and I think it feels really important to have a big tent mentality, get as many boots on the ground as you have, when it just feels like you're surrounded by all sides, to an actual articulation of what we're trying to do. What are we trying to preserve? Who are we trying to preserve it for? And I think this is maybe why I get a little hung up on the question of values, is in, you know, we just, in that great panel discussion about issues here in the Wasatch, I have no doubt that everyone up there very, very broadly agrees that you want mountains to be, relatively open and undeveloped and beautiful, full of wildlife, clean water, all these sort of like things from 10,000 feet. But when it comes down to it, there are very different visions about who gets prioritized, what gets prioritized, how to enact that, and that's why I think like articulating different moral and ethical frameworks that people from different sides of the conversation are coming to the table with can be useful. And I like to think this is maybe a way you can avoid running into some of the dead ends that we run into when we talk about mountain biking in wilderness, or things that really become polarizing, where maybe it's better to know ahead of time that if you're coming to the table with a mountain biking advocacy organization, it's going to be a non-starter if mountain bikes are not allowed in the protected area. And even though you may think wilderness is the gold standard because it is the highest level of protection we can afford, and you are biocentric and you want this primarily to be wildlife with recreation second, maybe there's a way to find compromise if you know that you differ on something. I don't know, I think about that a lot.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense to me. And I guess I do think about, to kind of take your first question first, I do think about moving from that reactive mindset into a more long-term positive vision for what we want our public land system to look like in this country. And I think that is a challenge and an opportunity to engage in some big picture thinking and some soul searching about what that looks like. I mean, to go from there to the second point about sort of like more pointed user conflict, I think that, to take the mountain bikes and wilderness example, I think that is an example of a place where people become very fixated on a particular tool to achieve an end, right? It's like the end is not necessarily wilderness protection. The end is protecting that landscape from certain threats or protecting it for certain values. And if there are other ways to do that in a way that's accommodating of people's interest in that landscape, in a way that's sustainable, in a way that really does meet those big picture values, I think that is often a source of conflict between the traditional conservation community and outdoor recreation, in that there can be inattention from conservation organizations at times to the effects that decisions have on people. And I don't think that necessarily implies in ordination of values to say that people come before the conservation value of the landscape. I think that can remain an open question, or it can you can resolve it and say that conservation is the most important, but we're going to carefully tailor the way we circumscribe people's activities in a way that's really meeting a legitimate need, making sure that we're treating user conflict as user conflict and not turning it into an environmental issue or a moral issue when really it's a user conflict issue.
So there's so much in what you both are saying that I want to pick up on. Before I jump into this whole question about conservation to advocate to what I would even say problem solver, like what we're talking about here, right? That just being an advocate may not be enough because there maybe are inherent tensions. Before I go there, I want to reflect a little bit on what really are the tensions between recreation and conservation. I think there's this tendency to often position things as being mutually exclusive. I think we've heard here that that's not necessarily the case, right? It's not that we can't recreate in these places in a way that's promoting conservation, and maybe there's benefits of having people recreating. But where do you see there being some inherent tensions, right? Because maybe mountain biking in wilderness is something that is mutually exclusive, at least how it currently is. Where are those inherent tensions, and maybe where there are key alignments we can really start to build on to build some shared ground, some common ground?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the tension between recreation and conservation can be real at times. I do firmly believe that what unites us is much greater than what divides us. I think what I was talking about earlier about just making sure that we're giving attention to to the real issues that we're trying to solve, the real values that we're trying to put in place on the landscape, not becoming too enamored of any particular solution there. I think that's important. I mean, I think that there is a difference in focus between recreation organizations, recreation-focused advocates, and traditional conservation organizations. But there's also a lot of value in that we're really bringing different arguments to bear for hopefully largely the same things, right? I think the traditional conservation community does a great job of talking about the intrinsic value of places, the ecological value of places, but don't always do as good of a job of talking about the social value of places. And there are decision makers who are more receptive to that sort of message, who want to hear arguments about the outdoor recreation economy, who want to hear arguments about what places mean to people. And the outdoor recreation community is well positioned to really authentically deliver those arguments in a way that hopefully, in concert with the efforts of other public land stakeholders is bringing value in terms of conservation at the high level.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think your point about trying to avoid the subordination of values is maybe crucial here, because I think part of my article was very much saying, I believe in a subordination of values. I think recreation values should be below biological values when we consider conservation. But I also totally respect the position that that's not a politically effective way to get things done. I do think the tension between recreation and conservation is interesting. I largely wanted to avoid this in my piece because, as you pointed out, I think I was more interested in the bigger picture. But there's a growing literature on, of course, the effects of recreation at large scales on wildlife, on watersheds, on our shared resources. We've heard a lot about that at this meeting, and that's certainly a really obvious tension that there's not a simple answer to. In the literature I based a lot of my argument on, there's this sort of foundational divide between what they called appreciative and consumptive recreators, and this was back in the 70s. So they basically framed it as cross-country skiers and bird watchers versus hunters and anglers, and then did a bunch of tests to see whether that recreation type predicted how they voted, all these other things, and whether or not that was ever useful. I think it's really hard to draw those lines now, and the rest of the 40 years later, we know that it's actually more based on these inherited cultural and political values that determine these things, not what you do. And can you say that tenkara fly fishing is consumptive in the way that it signals this particular set of values in the way you could with the traditional rod and line 40 years ago? Those are very different cultural cohorts and have probably very different backgrounds they're bringing to the table. But what I do think still remains true, and maybe this is another part of our disagreement, or at least difference of opinion, is that recreation can be considered extractive. And it's not, the question of where we draw the line on that, I'm really open to. Do I think recreation is always extractive? I don't. It might take a few beers for me to get there, but I do think it can be.
Yeah, I mean, I think what maybe lost me a little bit in your piece was that it seemed like there was a connection being made there between those activities and certain conservation values. But I do agree that recreation that has become unsustainable on a landscape has the same characteristics as extraction, right? And so I guess I would sort of set as the bottom parameter of the conversation almost that we're not interested in advocating for that. I mean, that's certainly not something that our organization wants, that our member organizations want, that I think the sort of responsible outdoor recreation community writ large wants. It's we want to engage in activities that are sustainable and that are going to be there for generations to come, not going out and tearing up a landscape for the sake of getting rad.
Could you define getting rad for the audience?
It's closely related to Stoke.
Sending it, right? So I want to pick up on that, because what I'm hearing from you both is that a conservation ethic probably is not enough to guarantee advocacy and supporting conservation on public lands, right? You might really care, but you may not be out there advocating, doing things to actually protect those places. And the flip side of that is being an outdoor recreationist is not enough to guarantee that you're using those places sustainably and advocating for the sustainable protection of those places. So how do we move people along that spectrum? And again, going even just beyond being an advocate, because you might just be advocating for protecting the thing you value at the expense of other values, right? Going beyond that to actually being a problem solver, right? How do we move people to capture that stoke, to capture the conservation ethic, to actually make folks advocates for problem solving on these places, for finding sustainable solutions that work for lots of different users and purposes? It's a big question.
Yeah, that's the question, I think. I think that's something we spend a lot of time thinking about at Outdoor Alliance. We talk a lot about the advocacy pyramid is something that I think is sort of like in the organizing literature, talking about sort of moving people from really basic actions like clicking on an action alert or signing a petition to, writing a personalized message to their lawmaker, to making a phone call, to showing up at a meeting, to, engaging in much more complex forms of advocacy. And hopefully there's an education that goes on through that process, not just in terms of how the process works, but also in terms of values like collaboration and problem solving, and becoming more clear-eyed about what a real conservation ethic needs to look like to be an effective advocate for the things that at some level I think most of the people in our communities value. But it's a process, and it's challenging. I mean, I think the land management decision-making process is complicated. Democracy is complicated, and it's a real task. It was, what Sally Jewell said yesterday about the outdoor industry being a mile wide and half an inch deep. That is 100% true, and I don't think that we should ever pretend that we're going to be able to recreate the advocacy model of like the oil and gas industry. Like, that's just not what the outdoor industry looks like. That's not like what the outdoor recreation community looks like. But we have different strengths, and it's really an organizing challenge to bring people into this conversation and help them become effective advocates. My colleague at OA who just left to go be a stay-at-home dad is an organizer, and he came into organizing from this nonprofit that was focused on like foreign policy. And he explained this thing. What he explained to me was that when in his previous job, what was so hard was before he could even really get to the nuts and bolts task of organizing people to do a thing, he had to get all of those people to sort of see themselves as a community of interest who had these shared values and could sort of work in concert to achieve a result. And he was just so fired up when he came to work at OA because he saw that this huge first step in the organizing task was like already there for him. There was already this huge community out there of people who identified with one another and saw that they had this sort of shared identity and these shared values that included, conservation. And all he had to do was like get all these people to start doing the stuff because they already saw themselves as a community of interest that had these values, and it made the job so much easier for him in his telling. So like, I guess that's sort of the kind of things that I'm thinking about a lot in terms of how we engage people and move them into advocacy.
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot because I feel like it's an obvious question after you read a sort of negative article like mine, which is like, well, what can we do? How do you bridge this divide? And I've kind of decided that I just don't have the experience to answer it. In that I'm not an organizer. I'm not actually out in the trenches in this way. But I do, and I promise this is not too much of a tangent. But I have also spent a lot of time thinking about conservation in Melanesia, in New Guinea, in the Southwest Pacific, which is on one level incredibly different from here, mostly because you have 99% indigenous land tenure and effectively have no history of colonization. And I've worked in this community that recently put together what's the highest formal level of protection you can give a landscape in Papua New Guinea, which is a conservation area, which is sort of a collaboration of different traditional landowners that they agree to abide by certain use rules and set aside land for certain purposes. And this area is the largest such area in Papua New Guinea, and it was set aside because it is the last really good habitat for the world's largest butterfly, big charismatic insect that's been decimated by palm oil. And getting this thing put together took 40 years. And basically these two environmental lawyers, Papua New Guinean environmental lawyers, who grew up on this plateau, they would joke when they started they had a full head of hair and now they have no hair. It was just so stressful because you had 16 different language groups in a small area and then 150 different tribes, and they all wanted different things. And what I was sort of reflected about, like, how did they manage to do this? What are the challenges they face? The first, like, really hopeful message, which I think ties in to what you were saying, is like one thing that seemed to be really effective was saying, like, this is all our home. And people had not traditionally had an association with the Queen Alexandria birdwing butterfly, but it became sort of a symbol of their home. They're like, this is our place, this is part of our identity. But maybe the less hopeful or more daunting prospect was that it took 40 years of conversation with individual shareholders about how they wanted their land used and what they were willing to say no to. And that is just I think an unavoidable task of trying to reach consensus, even when you broadly want the same things, which in their case was forest and a good quality of life for their kids.
So we can come back a little bit more to this notion of building consensus, but we're getting a lot of questions from the audience about the outdoor industry. And Lewis started to refer to this, so I want to pick up on that a bit more. There's a general question of, is the outdoor industry's role just really promoting recreation and getting people out there? Is that what they're doing? And is that what they should be doing? So I'm going to ask the question of, what is the outdoor industry really doing around this tension between recreation and conservation? Are there any promising things happen? And what would we really like to see the outdoor industry do? And recognizing that challenge of it being really broad, but not very deep, right? That organizational challenge.
Yeah, so I don't work in the outdoor industry. I work in advocating for the outdoor recreation user community, but we do partner really closely with the Outdoor Industry Association. And in DC, they have sort of like a bifurcated government affairs agenda. One part of it is trade, which I know nothing about. And then the second part is public lands conservation. And I've worked really closely with the Outdoor Industry Association on any number of things. I think that they are great partners. They generally are extremely deferential to the people doing, like, to us, to conservation organizations, to the values of like their customers, essentially. And I'm honestly generally very impressed that they are an industry trade group. Like, that's what they're there for, is representing businesses, but they pursue a public lands agenda in DC that I think is extremely positive. And they play a very helpful role on advocacy there in terms of bringing the business voice to bear on questions of public lands policy, and being there as business people to articulate the benefits for their business to protected public lands and conservation. So I have pretty positive feelings about them.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've sort of voiced some of my concerns about, when the rubber hits the road, how much those values overlap, but I certainly wouldn't want the outdoor industry to be involved in public land advocacy. I mean, and maybe it's just a little bit of a inherent distrust of corporations and profit motive that I think is generally healthy.
Yeah, and I think there is probably a fair distinction to be drawn between, the government affairs agenda of OIA and the role of outdoor industry in terms of like promoting places or, specific on the ground impacts in more discrete locations. So I recognize that I probably only covered a corner of that topic.
Yeah, and I also think maybe this is an area where it's really helpful to have something like OIA, but it does feel like often, the efforts of like a few very visible corporations like Patagonia or Black Diamond, who have sort of these like founders who set a vision early on that this was going to be part of their mission, has carried a lot of water for the rest of the industry. And again, if it's a mile wide and 3 inches deep, there's potentially a lot of businesses who benefit from public lands, who benefit from sort of the general goodwill. I won't say greenwashing, because I do think Patagonia and Black Diamond do great work, but they sort of by association benefit from the sense that the outdoor industry really has the same interest at heart as conservationists. And that maybe is where some of my skepticism comes from, and that's not necessarily 100% founded, but I would be curious to see or maybe discuss potential solutions if we kind of agree that some sort of excise tax is off the table because it's just too difficult to implement, or maybe if you buy their argument that there's too much of an import tariff on Cordura or whatever it is there a role for legislation in sort of encouraging companies to do the right thing, or are we entirely dependent on this voluntary model that gets at the sort of better angels of our nature?
I'm trying to decide how much to say here. I think that the excise tax is going to be a major topic of conversation in this Congress, and so I would not say that it's off the table. And again, I wouldn't want to get ahead of myself, but I think that there probably is a conversation to be had. I don't know if ultimately the outdoor industry or even our organization gets to yes on that. But it is an idea that has some merit, and I think it's definitely heating up as a topic of conversation. I would hate for that to distract from the obligation. I mean, I think it is a worthwhile idea to consider regardless, but I would hate for that to draw attention away from the obligation of Congress to fulfill its responsibilities to appropriate money for the public lands. I mean, I think that was a big theme of a lot of the presentations we saw here, were agencies not getting adequate resources, and the tendency just to view that as the inevitable state of affairs with a dysfunctional government is it can be a little bit defeatist, and I think that we should all demand better of our representatives. I think that this is an area of broad bipartisan agreement at the individual grassroots level, but that broad bipartisan agreement is not reflected in Congress, and I think that particularly people with a more conservative worldview who share our values on public lands have an opportunity to reach out to their members of Congress and say, look, I'm with you on these other philosophical issues or whatever it might be, but you're losing me on the public land stuff here. You need to support conservation, support adequate funding for the land management agencies. And I think we shouldn't let those guys off the hook, but I do think that there is potentially a broader role for industry to play in funding for public lands.
So I'm going to pick up on that topic of the recreation isn't the only impact on public lands, right? It's not the only risk. We've heard a lot about that over the last 2 days. So what do you see as some of those key risks to public lands, the things that we need to be thinking about conservation to perhaps counterbalance? And what role is there for recreationists, for the recreation industry and other allied fields to respond to those challenges, in addition to what you've already said?
Gosh, I mean, it's a long list, right? I mean, climate change, extractive industry, development, water quality. Yeah, it's a long list, and I think that we all have a common set of values around averting those negative effects. And I do think that in general, apathy about public lands is a much bigger problem than their overuse in a recreational context. That if we're able to harness that enthusiasm that people have for public lands and use that to motivate action to address some of these bigger challenges, that has a really positive role to play.
Yeah, and I think this kind of returns to I certainly agree with your list of possible threats, surrounded on all sides, as I said earlier, but I do think this kind of returns back to setting out a positive vision for what we actually want as Americans, as people who care about public lands. And maybe this is also a way to think about your engagement pyramid and how if a sort of a threat like we faced a few years ago with basically the idea of selling off public lands, returning them to private ownership, or maybe just returning them to state management, that is a sort of meta threat that I think is very easy to tie recreationists' experiences to, where it's like, we all know public lands, we all like them, this seems bad, let's fight that. I think where it gets tougher is questions of like, how do you make sure that BLM land management policies are going to allow for like continued elk or pronghorn migration in a really oil and gas rich area of Wyoming where you don't have a recreational constituency, or that is where I wonder how you can make the leap.
Yeah,
and you probably have a lot of thoughts about this.
I do. I think that we think a lot about public process around public lands and about sort of those overarching policy principles that would affect something like that positively, like making sure that we're standing up for sound science and decision making, whether that's around recreation or anything else, right? It's like we don't want, right, I mean, we want sound science, we want public process in the decision making. I think that there are policies. I had this insight as I was just sort of chewing on all of this stuff over the last couple of days, which is like maybe we should just be working on policy and just not worry so much about the specific place-based stuff. I mean, I don't really think that's the answer, but maybe being able to take people's specific, discrete, local experiences and articulate that as an example of something that's affected by these bigger picture policy issues, like saying, like, I know you want to be involved in the forest planning process on your local national forest, which is really important because that's where you go mountain biking. But if we pull the National Environmental Policy Act out of the forest planning process, your voice isn't going to matter anymore. So you need to stand up for NEPA. So, I think making those connections between people's very localized, very self-interested desires and these big picture policy objectives that affect all these places, even the less charismatic ones, is a way for us to really deliver value in conservation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So we don't have a lot more time, and there are maybe two questions I'd like to get through. So let's see if we can get thoughts on both of them. There's a question here about how does Stoke intersect with affluence and whiteness? And I wanted to get us to think a little bit about diversity and equity and how does this play in. So the question continues, it seems to be reserved for those with time and means to recreate in the outdoors, and I'm wondering how you both view this conversation in an environmental justice context. How does that intersect with this divide?
Yeah, I think that's the great elephant in the room, and something that is very difficult for me to speak to. But I do think it just highlights the fact that recreation is a huge diversity of experiences and means a huge amount of different activities. And also that I think some of the emphasis on, say, national parks or sort of the crown jewels of our American landscape is maybe misplaced and not an incredibly effective way to get new people under the umbrella of the broader environmental movement. And that for most people, your first experiences with nature come from a state park or a city park, or fragments of natural landscape next to a huge population center. And one of the things that's been really interesting to stew on being here in Salt Lake City is how you sort of have both of that in immediate proximity. You have both a huge, growing, and fairly diverse metropolitan area with natural spaces that are sort of inherently urban, but up against wilderness and sort of scenic majesty. And I don't have any answers to that, and I know there are a lot of organizations doing really good work to connect disadvantaged communities with open space, both from sort of an environmental justice perspective and all the benefits that it brings us, that we've heard about some during this conference, but also as part of a broader movement to bring new people into conservation. And all I can say is that I think it's a great movement to learn from and hopefully engage with a little more detail. And maybe that's where the promise of these sort of new collaborative efforts to fight climate change at a national level have potential, where it's like these issues around biodiversity conservation and public land access and environmental justice and community health are all intrinsically linked, even though the communities who face them are coming from very different places based on stratification of race and class.
Yeah, that was really well said. Yeah, I agree that I feel like I see how sort of the Stoke language, where a fixation on a community that's overwhelmingly white can be problematic. And I would not want, I guess I see Stoke as sort of, I don't want to say like synonymous, but analogous, or serving some of the same functions as awe, like Stephen was talking about yesterday, of just enthusiasm and joy that comes from these kind of like visceral experiences in the outdoors. But I see how that word choice could be off-putting for some people. I agree wholeheartedly that we need to do better in terms of making sure that we have a public land system that delivers for everybody, bringing new voices into the conversation around public lands management. I think that as an organization that's cultivated some expertise in civic engagement and public process around public lands management, we're trying really hard to partner more with some of those affinity organizations that are doing really good work and making sure that we're doing a good job of sharing the opportunities that we have, making sure that we're letting those communities speak for themselves, and being partners in that space and trying to invite more people purposefully into outdoor recreation.
So just in conclusion, you picked up on something that was my final question, is around, Steve mentioned awe yesterday, and there's a lot of questions about instilling a land ethic. And it seems to me that even if we need to be working at the policy level, we also need to be working at the local level to make sure that people care, right? Whether that's through, I get so stoked when I go out and I ski, or I just value this place for everything it is. People need to care if they're gonna advocate and support. I think that's a pretty likely truth. So are there any concluding thoughts you have about how we can work to instill that land ethic, to build that support, to help people value these places so that we can lead into action?
I guess I just have a really brief comment, which is I think it can really involve just tapping into people's curiosity, something that I think everyone has inside them, and just the slight nudges to draw the connections between the snow you're skiing on, the foothills you're riding your mountain bike on, and the fact that this is part of a bigger watershed, and within that watershed you're part of a bigger biome, a bigger region, and kind of using that as a way to tie recreational experience into a greater grounding within place.
Yeah, I would say just get involved. Like get involved with local organizations. Whether that's doing like on the ground stewardship activities or advocacy. Get involved with national organizations that represent your interests and look for opportunities to kind of like roll your sleeves up and get in the game. And I think just encouraging people to do that, encouraging people who've shown an interest in advocacy to find those opportunities, helping people become involved. That's helping people make that transition from enthusiast to advocate.
So I hear a new theme coming out. Get curious, get stoked, get involved. So with that, I want to thank our speakers for being willing to stand up here and just talk about these complex issues. Pass it off to you, Bob.
So let me once again just thank everyone for joining us for the 24th Annual Wallace Stegner Center Symposium. I do have a couple quick thank yous, particularly to Jan Nystrom and Chris Monty, who really did the lion's share of the work of organizing everything and keeping things moving throughout the last 2 days. I also would like to thank the College of Law staff in its entirety, who really rallied this year, as they do every year, to make sure that we're able to run this symposium at the highest possible level. And to my colleagues at the Wallace Stegner Center here at the university, Danya, John, Robin, and the others, thank you for the support that you've provided. Once again, I'd like to thank our principal funders for the symposium, the R. Harold Burton Foundation and the Cultural Vision Fund, as well as our other supporting funders, the S.J. and Jesse E. Quinney Foundation, the Nature Conservancy of Utah, and the Natural Resources Law Forum. I would like to remind you once again that we do read and take to heart the evaluations, both in terms of how we run and manage the symposium, but also in terms of topics. So please, if you haven't, take a couple minutes to fill that out on the online evaluation form. And then let me just put my glasses on so I get the final two quick announcements right. We do have 2 more programs coming up before the academic year is over. Next Thursday, March 28th, over the noon hour here at the College of Law, we'll be hosting former United States Senator Jeff Bingaman from New Mexico. He's going to be talking on the subject of bridging the divide. And he'll be discussing the obstacles that make it so difficult to find common ground on policy disputes in Washington, D.C., something we've heard about during the last few days. So let me encourage you to join us over the noon hour for that. There's no registration required, and it's an event that's free and open to the public. And if you really want to dive deeply into some of the conservation issues that we've discussed, on Friday, May 3rd, we'll be hosting a half-day conference here on the topic Trying Times, Conservation Easements, take a deep breath, and Federal Tax Law. And that's an absolutely critical dimension of understanding the attraction of conservation easements for protecting important private landscapes. That is an event where registration is required. It's available online. So with that, let me conclude our 24th Annual Symposium, and let me thank everyone once again for all of the support that you've provided. We really do appreciate your attendance and interest in the topics that we've been addressing. Thank you.